So we are live. So we're on chapter 6 in the book. I think we're on session 8. So, but we're in chapter 6, and it's called The Promise of God. Here comes Alan. Just a word of comment before we get started. I think that next time I do a Bible study, I really like this Kerygma series, but I think I'm going to look at the Kerygma resource before I do the study. Because this one's a little bit different, and the way they look at things and group things is a little bit different than I would do. So it's been somewhat of a challenge of how to corral what they want you to do, what they want you to do. I look at the leader's guide, and they have they have a lot of different activities, like play acting and all this other stuff that's designed for larger groups and breaking up in smaller groups, and it doesn't work for this particular environment. So that's just a word of comment. Alan, since you just came in, I'm going to ask you to pray. So, what the book did in this particular chapter is, in a way, this is a transitional chapter or overview chapter. I mean, the chapter specifically at some point deals with a short text, but I think if you noticed in your reading, it spent a lot of time talking about the whole Abraham narrative. So that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on tonight is kind of giving an overview of the narrative, and then we'll in the upcoming sessions break that down a little bit further. So we're talking about the overall narrative is Genesis 11, 20 through 25, I think. 25:18, which is a fairly large group of reading. At some point, we'll be specific with Genesis 11, 20 through 12, 9, which is much shorter. So, we'll go ahead and start, as we usually do, by reviewing the central affirmations that seems to govern our study through Genesis. God creates creation and has a specific purpose for it. The relationship between God and creation develops through speaking and listening. God's word to creation is a sovereign call, but it is the kind of call which invites obedience rather than demanding allegiance. God loves creation, but creation refuses to let God be God. The relationship between God and creation is marked by tension between God's purposes and creation's resistance to God's purposes. We'll see a little bit of how that tension is somewhat resolved through the person of Abraham and Sarah, but it still exists to a certain extent, because Abraham and Sarah, even though they are faithful, they are still human beings, and their faith life is more complicated than just always doing what God says, which is the way the human condition is. Even the most faithful in history have their difficult times. They have their struggles. They have their times of trial. They have their times of doubt. They have times where they're just tired of the journey. There's times where they're discouraged and in despair. Sainthood does not mean perfection. Living a life of faith does not mean necessarily always being good. And it certainly doesn't mean that once you decide to live a life of faith that everything is going to be hunky-dory. I think we've all realized that in our life, right? So, another way of getting started is so this overview leads to the promise, the title of the chapter, which is the promise of God. So let's set the stage by asking some questions about our personal life. If God told you to leave your home and your family and go to some unknown place, and told you that you could only carry 5 things with you on that journey, what would you take? Take your medication, okay? I hear ya. I have to do the same thing. Take the Bible. What? Okay. It's kind of a hard question because we don't know where we're going, right? Because it's an unknown place. Modern society, we kind of assume that we won't go to a place that is completely out of civilization, but we don't know. Yeah. What else? Food and water. Necessities. Okay. So we got medication, food and water, survival kit, Bible. Anything else? Clothing. Cash. If you're leaving your family, what else would you bring? Something to remember your family by? Pictures, photo album, phone with your pictures on it, right? Assuming you can get bars wherever you are, where you go. Okay. If the change of this life was not your choice, how would you finally accept the fact that it was necessary? there's a change in your life that you didn't choose. And this is a reality for some people. For example, going to the nursing home. Sometimes that isn't their choice, is it? But there can be other ways. But there's a change in your life that you didn't plan on. It wasn't your choice. What would you need in order to be okay, or to believe that the fact of that change was necessary? What? Faith. So belief that it is God's purpose, or at the very least, that God's going to provide for you, right? And it's maybe a way that God is going to provide for you, right? Anything else? Reassurance from other people. You have to face the reality of what makes that change necessary, right? My father had to come, looking at my father going to the nursing home, he had to face the reality that he couldn't take care of himself anymore. He couldn't take care of his dog, and he couldn't take care of himself. That was a hard thing for him to accept. But in order for him to be able to accept that change in his life, he had to accept that reality. Some people don't, and they fight it all the way through. What is the hardest thing about the change? Right. Thinking about what you're going to lose. Yes. What have you got us into? So, yeah. Right. Reassurance, and also a certain amount of faith that your husband makes in the end. Can make good decisions sometimes, right? Hardest thing about the change is what we're leaving behind. And the unsureness of what's going to happen to us. So it's a fear, in a way, of what could happen in the unknown. And unsureness of whether or not we can handle it. Right. Yeah. So if somebody's used to moving and used to changing home every 5 or 6 years, that kind of change isn't as hard. But other types of change may be harder for those who are constantly changing. kinds of plans do you have to make in order to make the change go smoothly? So, what you had to do was you had to determine who you were. So no matter where you were, you had that security of saying, I may not know this place, but at least I know myself. And that'll help me make friends, choose how to make friends, right? Marilyn, you have recently moved within the last year, or is it 2 years? 2 years? Yeah. Well, what plans did you have to make in order to make that move, that change? So you had to decide what you were going to keep and what you were going to get rid of. You had to decide what kind of change it was going to be, or what kind of place you wanted to move to. You didn't just move to any old place. You had to make plans of saying, okay, what is it that I need? Sometimes we have the ability to make those plans. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're just uprooted and we don't have the ability to choose what kind of house we live in, what kind of community we live in, what resources we have, how much money we have in the bank, who we know, and who we can trust. So sometimes we have the ability to make plans, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have that ability taken away from us. What challenges or benefits did the change promise? Yeah. No matter where you were, no matter where you're going, it was going to teach you something. You were going to learn something out of the process. And you might know enough about yourself and your relationship with God that you knew that no matter where you went to, you were going to make it. You were going to survive. You weren't going to curl up and die. More than likely. There are some people in our world that don't have that security. I'm thinking of the Palestinians who are leaving Gaza. They have everything taken away. They're going somewhere and they have no idea whether they're going to live or die, whether they're going to have food or not. What might have happened if you decided not to make the change? So back to you, Marilyn. What might have happened if you hadn't decided to move? Right. It would get harder and harder for you to live. Yeah. So it'd be lonelier. It'd be tougher financially. It would be harder just to do the upkeep of a bigger house. with my father, what our family, what we had to convince him is that if he didn't make the change, he might end up homeless. Because the facility might not let him live there anymore. Which sounded harsh, not fair, but they had a right to determine whether he was renting where he was living. Okay, so, overview of 11:30 through 25:18. Some preliminary aspects to be considered. First of all, God's call specifically addresses Abraham and Sarah, but it concerns not only the formation of a people, but also the reformation of all of creation. So we read the Abraham story, the narrative, within the context of Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Chapter 1 through 11:29. Because because they are interconnected. There is something going on. And we talked a little bit about this the last section, but we're starting, there are 3 periods so far in Genesis that we're talking about that there's some similarities. First of all, with the creation story, creation ex nihilo. We're out of nothing. We start with the book of Genesis, and all it is a formless void. There may be water, but it's formless void. There's essentially nothing. And God starts creation. So out of nothing, God creates. God is the only one that can create out of nothing. The world can't just form itself. There has to be a force. Now, there are some scientists, astrophysicists, various people that might argue that point, but as people of faith, we will generally state that it's God as a driving force. God is the one that can create out of nothing, and that's how creation comes to be. It's how the heavens and the earth and all the animals and all the plants and all the trees and all the fish and the birds come to be because God creates them out of nothing. So we start with nothing, we get something. The next stage is the flood. Flood, I should say, resolution. The flood returns us back to pre-creation. Wipes everything off the earth. All there is water in this little ark. Noah and the animals can't do it by themselves. The creation can't stay alive under a big flood. God has to save them. And the flood returns the state back to nothing. So again, God is creating out of nothing. There's nothing there. And the third stage is Abraham and Sarah. Only at this time it's Abram and Sarai. But it is returned back to nothing. How? We are returned back to nothing. How? Any guesses? We haven't got to Sodom and Gomorrah yet. Okay, so after the flood, there is a genealogy. So there's a lineage going. So-and-so gives birth to so-and-so, father so-and-so, 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 and then something, all of a sudden in the history, that lineage stops. Why? How? Sarai is barren. So there is no hope for this lineage to continue. It's done. It's over. There's no hope. There's nothing. Because with Abraham and Sarai, it stops. Nothing. Emptiness. What has to happen? Can Abraham and Sarai overcome this? No. Way before fertility treatments. Only one thing can happen. Only one source can change that ending. God can make a new beginning, just as he began with creation, just as he made a new beginning after the flood. He makes a new beginning to Abraham and Sarah. Difference is, now instead of it just being so creation can continue, it's now so Israel can begin. Israel can continue. So now it becomes more specific. By embracing the call of God, Abraham and Sarah stand in sharp contrast to the resistant creation described in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. God's promise creates the possibility of a new community built on God's faithfulness. When they respond in faith, Abraham and Sarah are able to let go of the present and embrace God's promised future. So they become the new hope by embracing what God sees and what they can't see. They're in old age. They've been living with the reality of Sarai's barrenness for a long time. They can't imagine her having children. They had given up that hope a long time before. But God promises, so they believe. They step out in faith because God promises. That's faith. So, there are some source materials that provide insight into Abraham, the characters in the Abraham story. And we're not going to look up the passages necessarily. But each of these characters, along with Abraham, have their own specific challenges, and they have their own stories that speak of their need to embrace the promise. First there's Sarai. She has her own unique story of what she believes and what she doesn't believe. What's hard for her to believe. We'll read later on that when the angel comes to Abraham and tells Abraham that Abraham and Sarai are going to, out of them will come a great nation, and that Sarai is going to give birth, what is Sarai's response? She laughs. The angel is talking to Abraham. Sarai's listening inside the tent, and she just starts laughing. It's ridiculous to her. She thinks it's hysterical because she said, how is this even possible? When somebody says something, if I came up to you, Sheila, and said, tomorrow you're going to win the lottery of $1 billion, what would be your reaction? Yeah, you'd laugh right in my face. It's a ridiculous thought. That's her reaction. Lot has to face his own reality of what life means on his own, with his own family in a difficult place. And what it means to keep faith in a place that is antithetical to faith. And Isaac has to figure out how to live his life after experiencing his father being willing to kill him. Because God told his father to. Can you imagine being a young boy, trusting your father, going with your father, because God told your father that you were supposed to, not knowing where you're going. And once you get there, your father tying you up and putting you in an altar and pulling out a knife. Think that might cause a crisis of faith? Then we have Abraham's genealogy. There's also materials related to God's covenant. What God promises and what God asks. There's materials related to public events. What happens that are visible to everyone, for everyone to see. And materials that contain certain theological affirmations that God makes a promise that he keeps, that Abraham's faith is real, even with Abraham's testing. Somebody have their Bible? Somebody be willing to look up Hebrews chapter 11. It's in the New Testament, right before James. Chapter 11. The chapter. Start with verse 1. Keep going. Okay, I'll go from there. Or somebody. Okay. By faith, Noah, warned by God about events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, he received power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered himself faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of the heaven, and as innumerable as grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of a land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. So, what do we see? We see that so far in the story, we have people acting on faith. And the definition of that faith is sight unseen. Abel offers his offerings not knowing whether God is going to accept it or not. God accepts it. Enoch walks with God not knowing how his life's going to end. God takes him. Noah builds an ark essentially in a desert, not knowing what's going to happen, but God told him to, so Noah did it. Abraham picks up and leaves where he is, goes to another place, to another land, not knowing where that land is, who's there, what's going to happen, how he's going to live. Because God told him to. And he accepts on faith, even though his reality would tell him different, that he's going to be a father. He accepts it, even though it's hard for him to believe. And he can't see it. Not even in his mind's eye can he see it. But God promises, and he believes that God will fulfill his promise. He doesn't know how, he doesn't know when. He just accepts on faith that's going to happen. So, next slide. What? No. Keep going. Next one. So the narratives found in the larger Abrahamic story make theological statements not only about Abraham, but also about God. The narratives affirm a God whose promises are not based upon the present, but rather call people out of faith to a radically new existence. In other words, God sees not in the present, God sees in the future, and causes us to live in a radically new creation, a radical new existence where we trust the future rather than being locked into the present. We can't avoid the present, that's where we live. But we see the present in terms of what God has promised in the future. We live according to what God has promised rather than what the present dictates. Does that make sense? Given the power of the narratives, it should not surprise us that they exert a major influence on New Testament writers. They talk about the same thing. The New Testament writers are constantly returning to the themes that we find in this very narrative. And child of Abraham becomes something that Jesus returns to again and again as well. When a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years comes up and touches his cloak because she believes that even if she just touches his cloak, she's going to be healed, even though every person in her life for 12 years has told her that there's no healing for what she's got. Jesus calls her daughter of Abraham. Why? Because she's acting out of faith. There's no reason for her to believe that she has any different future, but she believes anyway. Right? When the religious leaders come to him with arrogance, he says, do not assume that you're going to be okay simply because you're children of Abraham. Because that Abraham's your father. Because God can take these stones and create new children of Abraham. They call themselves children of Abraham, but they're not acting out of faith. They're confirming their present. So, reason why Jesus says, I'm the way and the truth and the life. What God is calling to is a new way of existing where we are no longer living day by day, but we're living in faith, looking forward to the future, knowing that no matter what happens, God is in front of us, calling us forward, calling us to a new existence, calling us to a new presence. And God is always on the side of those for whom it seems hopeless. The lady who has been suffering for 12 years. In the parable, Lazarus, who's always been poor. It's not the rich man who ends up being side by side with Abraham. It's Lazarus. Because the rich man said, I got what I need. I don't need to think about what God is calling me to because I got what I need here. Look at what I've done. Lazarus has no other choice but to hope for the future. So Lazarus puts his faith in what God can provide for him. So, now we look at this particular passage here. So this text is pivotal in Genesis because it links the traditions of God's providential care for the world or creation to God's electing call of Israel. So, up till now, we look at God's providence in terms of providing for creation. Now, the short story shifts, where now it's God's providence, but it's in terms of election of a people. That God is no longer acting through the cosmos, but now acting through people, certain people. The hopes of creation is now resides in a certain people. we are introduced to barrenness of Sarai, and it is a metaphor to emphasize God's speech over humankind's hopelessness. So, when Sarai is born, is determined to be barren, the hope for the future of the lineage up to Abraham is gone. It's now hopeless. They're in a hopeless situation. But God speaks. Let's just read this passage again. So Genesis 11 through 12, 11:30 through 12:9. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out from Ur of Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make of your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother and son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oaks of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward Negeb. So first of all, we notice that the barrenness of Sarai is just, there's a brief mention of it. It's just mentioned briefly, and then they moved on. There's not a reason given for barrenness. It's not a punishment. It's not anything, but it's just a simple fact. And then God gives Abram receives three promises. First of all, land, then progeny, and then blessing. He has no reason to believe any of this. He has absolutely the freedom to say no to all of this. He could have stayed with his father Terah and not left Haran. He could have lived his whole life there. God gave him the freedom to do that. He could have not believed that Sarai was going to do it, was going to give birth. He could have said, "I don't believe you, God, just leave me alone." He could have taken one look at Canaan and said, "There's already people here. If I come in and try to build a home, they're probably going to kill me. I'm going to turn around and go back." At any stage, he could have stopped. He could have said, "No, I'm not. This is not me. This is not who I am. This is not." This is too much. He had no reason to believe, but he believed anyway. So the metaphor, the barrenness is a metaphor for hopelessness. We also see in this theme of promise. It uses a family and pilgrimage to bring a depth of understanding. So they're going on a journey. The journey, what's important about the journey is not the destination. What is important about any journey is how you take it, how you walk it, how you travel it. Very often in the journey of life, or whatever journeys we have, the destination which we reach very often is anticlimactic. Faith's relationship with reality. What we'll start seeing in the upcoming chapters is that Abram, later becoming Abraham, even though he is a man of faith, even though he takes a journey in faith, even though he believes God's promises, has moments where he struggles to keep that. And I'm not just talking about having to sacrifice his son. There's all sorts of smaller things. And what we also see on this journey is just kind of some mundane stuff that Abraham does. But there's choices he makes that aren't always the smartest. Call and response and faith development. God calls us to faith. God, going back to those initial affirmations at the beginning that we see at the beginning of every session, is that God invites, God doesn't compel. God calls, God doesn't ordain. So God calls us to live a certain way, but the free will, our choice to do it, becomes our response. And the faith is lived in that relationship between God's call and our response. And it's not always perfect. We're not always responding the way that God is calling us to respond. Because we're human beings. Sometimes we have a tough time believing that what God is calling us to. Sometimes we have a difficult time understanding what God is calling us to. Anybody who stands in front of a congregation and says, I've understood from day one exactly who and what God has called me to, every moment of my life of faith, is a liar. You look at all the major people of faith in the history, even contemporary ones like Martin Luther King Jr. He did not see himself as a leader of a civil rights movement. When he accepted the pastorship Ebenezer Baptist Church. He thought he was just going to be a preacher like his daddy was. And if he was successful, he might have a large church. And God had other plans for him. And you better believe at certain times, Martin Luther King probably says, God, can I just be a preacher? Because this is hard, and I don't want to do it anymore. And I don't know if I'm making a difference anyway, because people are still hating, and people are still beating on people, and people are still lynching people, and people are still doing all that. Am I even making a difference? Call and response. Systematic theology approach to reading Genesis. This overview. It's not a lot of issues about cosmology, except for the continuing story of creation. Eschatology, how things end, there's a lot of that. The lineage was expected to end. Abraham and Sarah were expecting to die alone. Ethics. We'll get in a lot of ethics in Abraham's story. The things that he is called to do that seem wrong, the things that he does that seem wrong on his own, that he does on his own. How does he work through that? Epistemology of how does he know what is true and what is not? The only thing we can bring into that is how his actions, his acting in faith. He does at this point in the story, he's not arguing with God. Later, that'll come on later on. But right now, he doesn't argue with God. We see no place in the story of Abraham so far where Abraham did anything but just act. We don't hear any words of, "Are you sure, God?" or "This can't be, God." "There's no way, God." "Choose somebody else, God." None of that. We don't see that in this part of the story. It comes later, but we don't see it at this part of the story. Critical themes in Genesis, God's promise. In every person's life, God has a promise of a future. Creation's new call. Before, with the creation story and with the flood story, the call is to be fruitful and multiply. The call is still there, but now the call is specific. To a people, starting with two people. To step out in faith. To go to an unknown place. The call is different. Instead of making a home that God has placed them already in and doing what God has, God is calling them to step out in faith, to go on a journey with God. That's it. Questions? We'll get to that. It happens later. It happens as a sign of a new covenant being formed between God and Abraham. What also happens at that time is all the males in the tribe of Abraham, in the nation of Israel. It's not really Israel yet. It hasn't been named Israel, but that group, the chosen people, all the males are circumcised as a sign of Abraham's covenant, which is always for us males a painful thing to think about. Well, at this point, everybody, all the males in Abraham's clan, including adult males, we're not talking about a baby Briss here, but that's happening. Servants, every male. So, but yeah, there's a specific reason for that, for the name change, where Abram becomes Abraham and Sarai becomes Sarah. Okay. Anything else? Covered a lot.